We are pleased that you can join us, and we look forward to this 18th annual lecture for peace, safety, and human rights, which we hold to push new frontiers of knowledge and to care in honor of the gallant legacies of two freedom fighters, which include the late Minister Abdullah Omar and Mr. Joe Moabi. We welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Social and Health Sciences in the College of Human Sciences at the University of South Africa, as well as the Psychological Association of South Africa and the Pan-African Psychology Union. Before handing over to my colleague, Professor Shonal Sufla, to present the opening message, I'll outline briefly the afternoon's proceedings. My name is Hugo Cannon. I'm a professor in the Institute for Social and Health Sciences. We will hear about the people that we dedicate the lecture to, and we will listen to messages by family representatives of Minister Omar and Mr. Moabi. We will then have the panel address by the esteemed speakers of the day, and I will introduce them at the time. Dr. Mahlakeng Khosi and Professor Edwige Talbayev. Professor Brendon Bonds will provide a response that engages the speakers' inputs. We will then make room for your inputs as the audience before Professor Sats Cooper presents the closing message and Nokolo Dumani gives us the closing thank you. Professor Sufla.
Thank you very much, Professor Cannon. Good afternoon, guests and fellow advocates for peace, safety, and human rights. It is my pleasure to offer opening comments to the 18th Annual Peace, Safety, and Human Rights Memorial Lecture. Like Professor Cannon has just pointed out, the lecture, which is part of an almost 2 decades-long scholarly and public engagement series, is a flagship event of the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at the University of South Africa. Again, as you've just heard, the lecture series was launched in memory of Mr. Dalla Omar, who was South Africa's first democratically elected Minister of Justice, and Mr. Joe Moabi, an anti-apartheid activist. And it's equally a tribute to the many people who have dedicated their lives to the struggle against apartheid and colonial oppression in South Africa, elsewhere in the world, and the fight for equality, justice, and freedom. So the lecture series seeks to highlight the shifting horizons and the challenges that face the culture of democracy, of peace, of safety, of human rights globally. And in this way, to bring focus to issues related to freedom, to independence, and to citizenship in the 21st century. The lecture series continues to evolve, I'm happy to say, continues to evolve in interesting ways and in important ways. Most notably, over the last 4 years, the Institute for Social and Health Sciences has partnered with the Psychological Society of South Africa and the Pan-African Psychology Union to host the lecture, moving towards what we'd like to think about as a far more collaborative, plural, and collective form of engagement, and very much in orientation to both more recognized, but also less distinguished, no less important subject matter related to the intent and the focus of the lecture series. So, for example, in 2019, the lecture panel included women from the Black Consciousness Movement. In 2020, we hosted members of the apartheid-era victims' families group, and in the last 2 years have included transnational collectives of scholar activists and activist scholars who would like to think of as agitators from various geographic and diasporic sites and spaces who address themes such as solidarities, global justice, and radical humanism, as well as aesthetics, freedom, and the political imaginative. Importantly, as is very much evident in the theme of this year's lecture, which is treading the shoreline, water as life and death, this collaboration that I talk about is in itself expressive of the imperative and the efforts to enlarge the epistemic, the conceptual and practice parameters of the work that we undertake in the social and health sciences in relation to peace, safety, and human rights, to account for planetary justice. As we all know, human activity threatens to make the planet unsafe, deeply unsafe for humanity, but also for other forms of life. So this notion of planetary justice then invites us, challenges us to shift our gaze beyond established ideas and goals of global justice, and very much what it does is that it draws our attention to what we could think about as the indivisibility, the inseparability of social, political, ecological systems in the Anthropocene, and the ensuing obligations on us across geography, across time, and across spaces at the very least. So as we gather this afternoon, South African time, for this annual lecture, the theme of this year's lecture could not be more relevant, could not be more timely, I would think. As we gather, it is quite impossible to ignore the profound and urgent transformations that are unfolding or that need to unfold in our world. We are challenged by the resolute assertion of the natural world to transcend the often sole focus on human-centered narratives, to transcend our anthropocentric worldview. So I'm sure you will agree with me that in this time, this epoch, our planet, the Earth itself, with its intricate social ecosystem and life-sustaining resources, and its grandeur and its complexity, has pretty much made its demands clear, pointing us very urgently to the inescapable catastrophes, inequalities, and the consequences facing us, but also, we would like to believe, to hope and to the opportunities. As we see in the description of this year's lecture, waters, typically symbols of sustenance and vitality, have fast become the epicenters and arenas of profound social, political, and ethical struggles, and literally of actual life and death. The harrowing grip of the necropolitics of water, as Professor Canham and others write about, and the associated despair and peril of this complex relationship between water and life, and water and death, and water and oppression, is probably nowhere more strikingly and distressingly evident in this moment of genocidal siege that we are witnessing in Gaza, literally as we meet today, where Palestinians are being denied access to their own resources, where the withholding of water has become an instrument of death, and also other resources, the denial of other resources, such as electricity, food, and fuel, leaving people to suffer and leaving people to die. And so today our gathering is not merely an intellectual exercise, but really an urgent call to action and a call for collective and ethical responsibility. The lecture focus invites us to understand that we find ourselves on the precipice of the Anthropocene, to reflect, to analyze, envision, and to act towards a more just and equitable, and I would say harmonious future for humans and for our planet. I have no doubt that the discussions today will deepen our grasp of this intricate web of challenges and opportunities that this planetary epoch presents to us, and hopefully will inspire us to tread the shoreline in directions and futures where water is a source of life and not of death. And so, Prof. Kanem, I end my message with the popular Palestinian slogan, "From the river to the sea," very apt in this moment, in echoing the lecture's call and commitment to addressing the critical issues of our time, and in recognition of the countless individuals who have dedicated their lives to the pursuit of peace, safety, human rights, well-being, and of liberation. To everyone who is on the webinar, thank you for joining us for this important discussion, this important conversation. I am very much looking forward to the engagement that lies ahead. Thank you, Prof. Kanem.
Thank you very much, Professor Safla, for that and for the framing of the lecture. We will now move into messages from the family of our, that the lecture is named after. Will you do that?
Yes, certainly. So the first message is from the Omar family, relayed this year through Mr. Hassan Omar. A brief introduction to Mr. Hassan Omar before we share the message. Hassan is the nephew of the late Dala Omar. He is a son of Mariam Omar and Hassan Omar, who is the elder brother of Mr. Dala Omar. He is his postgraduate qualifications are in law, tax, and forensics. He has had the privilege of having the home of Dala and his wife, Mrs. Farida Omar, as one of the many second homes in which he grew up, and obviously in which he experienced, he had many generative experiences and a huge impact on the way in which on the directions in which his life assumed, especially following in Mr. Omar's footsteps, which is to be of service to others. He writes, as he shares with us, "I'm very thankful to count Dala as a family member, as a guide, as a mentor, whose values of service, humility, sincerity, and justice continue to guide." Mohammed, thank you.
Respected hosts, mothers, fathers, comrades, youth, panelists, participants, and members of the Muabi and Umar families, I greet you with the universal greeting of may the Almighty's peace and blessings be and remain upon all of us. On behalf of the extended Umar family, kindly accept our most sincere gratitude for hosting and allowing us to be part of the 18th Annual Peace, Safety and Human Rights Memorial Lecture. We are indeed indebted to the Institute for Social and Health Sciences, in the College of Human Sciences, Unisa, the Psychological Society of South Africa, and the Pan-African Psychological Union for honoring the legacy of two outstanding sons of our country who dedicated their lives to make our beloved country a better place for all its people. 2023 marks just over 19 years since Abdullah Muhammad Umar returned to his Creator, a journey all of us are destined to undertake. He died at a relatively young age of 69, but lived a full life permeated with a resolve to, in all facets thereof, be of a benefit to others. To inter alia his extended family, clients, neighbors, communities, elderly, youth, comrades, country, and indeed the global oppressed people. We miss him in all capacities, as a husband, as a father, a grandfather, a sibling, an uncle, a neighbor, a leader, a visionary and upholder of justice, a freedom fighter, and a community activist. We will ever cherish his legacy, which in a nutshell is the political freedom of our country. The democracy we can enjoy due to the efforts of countless people like him. He would not be happy to hear this praise on him, as his efforts were premised solely on a sincere conviction to be of service to humanity, without any expectation of fame, gain, or reward. He did what he did for the sake and pleasure of his Creator, and it is our prayer that our Creator indeed be very pleased with him. But we need to consider his legacy in order to draw lessons therefrom and reflect on where we stand today. No doubt he would today be extremely concerned about how things have developed since 1994. Positive political and socio-economic changes during the first decade of our nascent democracy have been undermined and overtaken by rampant crime, brazen and unashamed corruption, state capture of public institutions, unethical leadership, political immaturity, paralyzed enforcement agencies, and the destabilization of health, education, and other essential services, etc., etc., etc. On the socio-economic front, poverty and unemployment levels is at unacceptably high and remains pervasive along racial lines. Wealth remains concentrated in the hands of a white minority. Load shedding due to mismanagement of infrastructure and resources has stymied economic progress. Reliance on government grants has reached record levels. Municipal functions have virtually collapsed, depriving especially the poor from basic essential services and hence eroding the foundation on which to promote economic prosperity. According to the World Bank's Global Poverty Database, South Africa ranks as the most unequal country in the world. The apartheid distortion of wealth and poverty has not only increased, but has become more entrenched. This is an embarrassing verification of the abject failure of our government to uphold the rights of our people as enshrined in our Constitution. We have to be honest about this failure and acknowledge the shortcomings of our government as a necessary step to analyze where we have gone wrong and if and how we can reverse this decay. Water is the essence of life, without which nothing can survive. Access to clean water and effective sanitation services are also rights enshrined in our Constitution. Although the number of people who have access thereto has exponentially increased relative to 1994 numbers, the lack of access to these essential services remain at unacceptable levels, particularly in the rural areas. Corruption, poor management, and the lack of necessary skills contribute to deterioration of our water infrastructure and ability to provide access to water and sanitation, compounded by the increase in our population and concomitant demand for a dwindling resource. This will serve to further aggravate the challenges we face in relation inter alia to health, hunger, poverty, housing, education, and economic opportunity. Without active, timely, and effective management of these challenges, we could find ourselves regressing from load shedding to water shedding. 2023 marks 19 years since the passing of Donna Omar and 29 years since our transition to democracy. We are faced with severe challenges that require reflection and attention. Perhaps we have relied too much on our leaders, placing too much trust in our political leaders and too little in our social activism. Donna Omar's fight for justice was rooted in grassroots community activism through vehicles such as the United Democratic Front. And perhaps it is time to relaunch and re-energize such forums to make the voices of our people paramount, and through which to hold our leaders and public representatives accountable for the mandates they have been given and undertaking. We wish your endeavour every success and may it serve as a springboard to contribute to the socio-economic upliftment of all our people. Thank you very much.
We thank Mr. Hassan Umar and the Umar family for that strong message and a very strong and resounding call to accountability and to just action. Thank you very much to the family. Next, I'd like to introduce to the audience the Moabi family representative. A message has been sent to us today by Mr. Khosi Moabi, who is the youngest son of Mr. Johannes or Joe Moabi and Stella Joyce Moabi. He holds a BCom degree in marketing management, and interestingly, he's an ex-football player from his time in the UK. He did a stint in nursing at the Northwest London Mental Trust, but quickly realized that this was not for him, and went back to university to complete a BCom degree in marketing management. Mr. Moabi has worked himself up the corporate ladder, having worked at various organizations in the last several years. Currently, he's located at the University of Fort Hare as the marketing and communications manager, and he has been in this position for the last 10 years, and by all accounts, his work has been quite impactful at the university. So we thank Mr. Khosi Moabi and the Moabi family for the message that's about to be shared. Thank you, Mohammed.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khosi Moabi, the youngest son of Joe Moabi. I would like to firstly acknowledge the distinguished guests and panelists. I'll start with Professor Hugo Khanman, Institute for Social and Health Sciences at Unisa, Professor Shanaz Safla, Institute for Social and Health Sciences at Unisa, Dr. Muna Dejani, London School of Economics and Political Science, United Kingdom, Dr. Khosi, National University of Lesotho and University of the Free State, Professor Edwin Talbayev from Tulane University, United States, Professor Brendon Barnes, University of Johannesburg, Professor Seth Cooper, Institute for Social and Health Sciences at Unisa, Ngotolo Dumani, also from Institute of Social and Health Sciences at Unisa. Ladies and gentlemen, good day once again. I am honored to have been chosen by my family to represent them at this lecture. For us as a family, it's a great honor to have our dad's legacy and memory being honored over this 18-year period. And we thank the Unisa and the team for acknowledging our father in this way. It's very much appreciated. This lecture aligns with a lot of my father's values in terms of it seeks to understand the challenges facing South Africa in relation to human rights. A subject matter my father was very passionate about and effectively fought for a very long period to attain our current democracy. And in this regard, I think he would be quite disappointed at where we are in terms of our human rights in South Africa. We still have issues and rights that are violated on a daily basis. Here I'm referring to rights such as access to water, access to safety, access to good health care. So there's a lot of rights that continue to be violated in our society, of which my father would be extremely disappointed in terms of what we have achieved over the last 20 odd years. I am resolute in that view that he would be disappointed. My father, yes, was a very serious man, a strict man, but at the same time very humble and very loving to his children. I recall that he used to love boiled sweets, and quite often would send the young children in the family to go and buy boiled sweets behind my mother's back, and he would tell them, no, go buy sweets. Don't tell Gogo that I've sent you for sweets. It's just between you and me. So he was a very, very jovial guy as well. But I also recall during exile, when we were in the UK, we spent a lot of time in the UK in exile, and he would spend a lot of time in the bush. And when he would come back in a very serious mood because of the areas that he was in and what he did. And we used to be quite anxious when he'd return home, because he would be serious, and when he called your name, you would be asking yourself, oh, what did I do now? So yeah, it really used to be an interesting time. But at the same time, there were some great memories of him that we have. I remember once that I was playing soccer in the UK, and he came to watch a game where I was playing in, and he was in the stands, and he would, when I got the ball, he would shout, move, very deep voice, move. And at halftime, most of my team were West Indian of heritage, and they turn around and say, Kai, in their accent, Kai, what's your dad saying? Why is he barking like a dog? Why is he barking like a dog? And I was like, no, he's not barking like a dog. He's telling me to move. But to them, it sounded like woof. So it was a very difficult time in terms of, it was funny, but difficult in terms of assimilating into the UK. But I took it lightly, and he took it lightly in terms of what he was referring to. One of the biggest lessons, and it was indicative of the kind of person that he was, one of the biggest lessons that my dad taught us was to greet people every day. Again, when he would come back from the bush, he would greet everybody on the street. Even if you didn't know you, he would greet you. And, the neighborhood and the British found that very strange. We were embarrassed about it, but very quickly the people got to know who we were, and it opened up a whole lot of doors in terms of friendships and relationships. And I think that was just indicative of my dad in terms of the type of person that he was, very humble, open, friendly, approachable. He has instilled the same thing into us. We're just really grateful as a family that Unisa and your distinguished guests can have such a lecture on his behalf. I am sure the panel can take this subject and discussion a bit further than I can. So I want to wish you well in your deliberations. I hope we can find some solutions to the challenges around human rights in South Africa. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, let me say, have a good session, enjoy, and we shall see you next year.
Thank you very, very much for those messages. Thank you for the affirming words, Mr. Moabi, and for the gentle memories that you have shared with us about a very difficult time of exile with your father. His memory has made us smile this afternoon, and we are grateful that you share him with us. Before we move then to the next part of the lecture, which is to hear from the panelists, I want to just talk briefly about water and begin with two short poetic excerpts about water. Derek Walcott, a Caribbean poet, wrote his famous poem, "The Sea is History." And he says, "Where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory, sirs? in that grey vault, the sea has locked them up. The sea is history. Kollega Putuma, who is a South African poet, writes an equally famous poem locally called Water. In memory, and she says, in memory of going to the beach every New Year's Eve is one I share with cousins, and most people raise black. How the elders would forbid us from going in too deep, to giggle, to splash in our black tights and ShopRite plastic bags wrapped around our new weaves, forbid us from riding the wave, for fear that we would be a mass of blackness swept by the tide and never to return, like litter. The elders forbid us, as if going in the ocean has food poisoning. I often wonder why I feel as if I am drowning every time I look into the sea. This and the feeling of being incredibly small. These are just brief excerpts from longer poems. So beyond the poetic form, those of you in Johannesburg may have experiences of water rationing in the form of water cuts and reduced pressure. We search the sky, anticipating rains to fill our rivers and therefore our reservoirs. And then there are places like my home village, where there has never been pipe-borne water, and where rainwater tanks and rivers serve as our only source of water. We also know historically that discoveries of the global south by imperial powers occurred as ships wound their way across the world's oceans. The slave trade occurred by moving people across water bodies. As we will hear today, the Mediterranean has become a death trap for North and West Africans. Water, though, is also life-giving. Contestations about the Nile River point to these registers of water as essential for life. Our first speaker will engage some of these dimensions. But climatic catastrophe has become perennial in the oscillation between drought and floods. In South Africa, Durban has not yet recovered from the 2022 floods, and Cape Town is still reeling from the inundation of floodwaters rising seas. Cholera outbreaks become more common as water treatment and management flounders along with other services in failing municipalities. As water becomes even more scarce, inequality is exacerbated. The role of capital increases and water becomes commoditized. Some can afford to buy water and others simply cannot. And even those who can, it's only a matter of time before it runs out for everybody. In case some attendees are unsure about why an event co-hosted with the Psychological Association is talking about water, given the increasing salience of water, I should observe that your patients or clients, in whichever way you term them, will bring stories of water to your psychotherapeutic encounters. And if that is not convincing, note that even Freud could not escape water metaphors in his theorization of the mind. So you will recall from your first year training at university that the unconscious mind is the largest part of the iceberg below water. The preconscious is just below the water surface, and the unconscious mind, or the conscious mind, is accessible, right, above water. We are seized with questions, though, much more pressing in relation to of power, of politics, of climate justice, water as life and as death. And we'll hear a bit more about this today. So I'm going to move to introduce our speakers for the day. I'm going to start with Dr. Muna Djani, who would have been the first speaker. Dr. Muna Djani withdrew from participating in the lecture yesterday afternoon. We are sorry about this, but we fully understand the circumstances of a withdrawal. As a Palestinian, the encroaching bombardment on Gaza was too much to bear for her, and she could not, in her full conscience, participate in a lecture when life was under threat. I'll give a brief introduction to Dr. Dejane before moving on to our next speaker. But I want to bring her into the room today as an important part of this discussion. Dr. Muna Dejane is an action researcher with a background in critical political studies to understand environmental and water governance by employing decolonial and critical lenses. She holds a PhD from the Department of Geography and Environment at the London School of Economics, where she also got her PhD. Her PhD research focused on examining community struggles for rights to water and land resources in settler colonial contexts in Palestine and the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, and how farming practices acquire political subjectivity. We would have gained a lot from hearing about her work in struggles for water and how these are inflected by the political at all times. Therefore, our first speaker for the day is Dr. Mahlakeng, Khosi Mahlakeng. Dr. Mahlakeng is a lecturer at the National University of Lesotho in the Department of Political and Administrative Studies, and they are research fellow at the University of the Free State in the Department of Political Studies and Governance in South Africa. Dr. Mahlakeng is the author of Water Scarcity and Conflict in African River Basins, the Hydropolitical Landscape, which was published this year by Routledge. We are very honored to have Dr. Mahlakeng in our midst and to hear about Africa-based water struggles and conflicts based on his research. Dr. Mahlakeng will address us, and then we will move to Dr. Edwige Tamalet Talbayev, who I will introduce after we have heard from Dr. Mahlakeng. Thank you. Dr. Mahlakeng, over to you. You are muted, I think, yeah?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. If you allow me to, can I start with projecting my slides?
Absolutely. Mohammed, if you could help us with that.
Not a problem.
I'll just share the screen from here. Is it shared, the screen, my screen?
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This presentation provides a link between environmental stress, water scarcity, and conflict in the Nile River Basin. It seems a source of life has become a source of contention, conflict, and death. Today, as the demand for water as a fundamental and essential natural resource increase, people are perpetually impoverished and are dying as a result of inadequate water supply, degradation and depletion of water resources, and especially unequal distribution of shared water resources. The sad reality is that the distribution and protection of water, like oil, is being ensured through militaristic defense. Three things are true, as the statements supporting this year's memorial lecture states. Firstly, we have entered the planetary epoch, where through climate catastrophe and negligent human activities, the world has insisted itself into an anthropocentric world. Secondly, old hierarchies persist, and communities, especially those that are impoverished and oppressed, bear the brunt of floods, droughts, and treaties and agreements that render an equal distribution of shared water resources. And thirdly, life-giving waters from the Orange Sinku River Basin in Southern Africa to the Nile River Basin in Northeastern Africa have become the site of intensifying hydropolitics over who owns the water. By the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the realm of international relations has been seriously characterized by resource geopolitics. Now, this is the likelihood of a conflict caused by a lack of essential resources that transcend political boundaries. We are in an era where negligent human activity has a significant impact on water resources. In regions where water resources are shared and were once in abundance, competition for access has worsened. Resource-based conflicts, conflict either being verbal, political, or violent, have become a major concern to international peace and security when the concept of security is expanded to include environmental security. And this expansion of the concept of security includes the impacts of environmental stress locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. Therefore, such concerns makes it important to recognize that the risks are not just of humanitarian nature, but also include political and security risks that directly affect government. Ladies and gentlemen, now more than ever, we are quickly coming to the realization that the future cause of conflict among nations is disputes over water supplies. Resource scarcity, either environmental scarcity or water scarcity, is caused by rapid population growth, degradation and depletion of resources, and uneven distribution of resources. These three sources of scarcity can interact and reinforce each other in extraordinary ways and lead to resource capture and ecological marginalization. The trend indicates that the pressures leading to a conflict over water are greater today than in the past due to increasing water scarcity. We believe that water scarcity is an obstacle to economic development, and the social stresses it causes lead to conflict is almost conventional wisdom in international relations among scholars of international security. Within and around resource geopolitics, we get to see the emergence of hydropolitics, which refers to the politics of water and symbolizes the complex relations and interactions among states that share river basins. Shared water resources, such as basins, rivers, and lakes, have become a contributing factor to interstate disputes in different forms over the years. Shared water resources, because they flow across rather than along a political boundary, can become a source of tension and conflict due to the complicated environmental, demographic, diplomatic, historical, and geopolitical heat they generate. In addition, changes in the quantity and quality of shared water resources makes disputes increasingly heated and conflict highly likely. Countries become prone to conflict if the resource they are dependent on is either threatened or removed. Now, the most common environmental elements around which conflict can occur are population growth, water flow and diversion, salinization, floods, drought, climatic variation, and pollution. Moreover, the institutional capacity to adapt to climatic variability and growing demands is inherent to the emergence of conflict. These predictions of water conflict around the globe have become a focal point of international relations and have become firmly embedded in global diplomatic discourse. Despite contending beliefs regarding the occurrence of water conflicts, however, current river water shortages, the fierce competition over water in shared rivers, and the uneven distribution of international shared rivers constitute conditions for water conflict. 10 years ago, the United Nations had already pointed out that water shortages and the competition for water are at the heart of the global security challenge and could increase the risk of conflict. The United Nations also identified that 8 of the 13 major African river basins are prone to potential water-induced conflicts. Now, the Nile River Basin faces considerable challenges of water scarcity caused by rapid population growth, environmental degradation and depletion, and unequal distribution of water. This is the world's longest river at about 6,700 kilometers or 4,100 miles, shared between 11 riparian countries. The Nile is confronted with immense population growth, and the use of the Nile waters for a growing population can become a source of conflict. Population growth in the Nile Basin is increasing at an unprecedented rate, in which in 2010, the total population in the basin countries was 424 million, of which 232 million people live in the basin. The current total population of the Nile Basin countries is estimated at 487.3 million, of which 257 million people are estimated to be living within the Nile Basin. It is estimated that the total population in the Nile Basin will reach 647 million people by 2030. Per capita water availability in the Nile Basin countries fell dramatically. With the fall in per capita water availability, disputes over water supplies would become a serious cause of conflict amongst these riparian countries. A fall in per capita water availability, coupled with a rapid population growth, leaves most of these riparian countries faced with internal and interstate conflicts, immense droughts, and famine. It is predicted that by 2025, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi will experience water scarcity, while Uganda, Tanzania, and Eritrea will experience water stress. Moreover, one of the most contentious issues also related to the Nile is the utilization of available water resources. The Nile extends across political borders, and as a result has created misunderstandings or lack of beneficial agreements about the allocation of water. These agreements, that is the 1929 and 1959 Nile Water Agreements that govern the Nile River, have rendered unequal utilization of water between upstream and downstream riparian countries. These colonial agreements, respectively, continue to systematically deny the 9 upstream riparian countries access to the Nile, giving Egypt and Sudan exclusive proprietary rights to the Nile. As a result, they have kept Nile Basin countries in conflict over utilization of the region's most precious resource. The high dependence of all 11 riparian countries on the Nile Basin has also caused it to deplete. Factors such as land degradation, agriculture, industry, and domestic use are paramount to depletion and degradation of the Nile. Environmental degradation and depletion pose an alarming threat for conflict in this region. These high levels of water degradation, for instance, led to Egypt consuming approximately 20% more water in 2020 than it is already doing. This supposes that other riparian countries are left with little, if any, water to consume for developmental purposes. Therefore, this less consumption of water by other riparian countries mean more potential for disputes and conflict. In conclusion, water scarcity is already affecting every river basin in every continent. The Nile River Basin faces considerable challenges, all of which have resulted into an high result of water scarcity. Although the issues of water scarcity and conflict may not be widely observable until the coming decades, however, it is clear that disputes and tensions in the Nile River Basin and in shared water resources are central to scarcity. To avoid a possible conflict, shared water resources not only require equal access and distribution among involved stakeholders, but also imply equal responsibilities for sustainability and management of these resources. And lastly, there's also a need for institutional capacity over shared water resources to help absorb climatic changes, among other things, and thus simultaneously minimize the vulnerability to conflict and ensure the security of water and life. At the background of such inequality and oppression over water utilization from Southern Africa to North, East, and West Africa, I am honored, ladies and gentlemen, to have been a part of a lecture series that seeks to deepen the pursuit of sustainability, freedom, and justice. This also, at this point in time, goes to the people of Palestine, who for 7 decades have been confronted with oppression and injustice. My prayers go to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahlakeng, for that. We appreciate it. We did not see your face during your presentation, so maybe if you could, for a few seconds, return on screen, great. We appreciate that really macro view of the problem in the northern parts of the continent, but you remind us of the length of the Nile, right, and how it goes all the way towards East Africa and sustains about 11 countries, and the potential conflicts that might emerge there that move water from just a seemingly natural resource to one with political potentials and possibilities, if not dealt with appropriately. We will return to your lecture when Professor Brendon Barnes engages with it, and then later when the panelists, when the participants may ask questions. Thank you. Next, we're going to move. Okay, thank you. Yeah, great. So we're going to move now from Africa to the United States, but to talk about the Mediterranean, I think, by Dr. Edwige Talbayev, right? Who is a New Orleans-based literary and theory scholar working at the intersection of the Maghreb literature, Mediterranean studies, and the environmental humanities. She's an associate professor of French, an affiliate of the Environmental Studies program, and the founding director of Middle East and North African Studies at Tulane University in the United States. She's the author of the Transcontinental Maghreb Francophone Literature Across the Mediterranean, and she is the co-editor of several collections of essays, among them The Mediterranean Maghreb, Literature and Pluralism in 2012, Critically Mediterranean, Temporalities, Aesthetics, and Deployments of the Sea in Crisis, which is published in 2018. The Water Logics is a project that is forthcoming, that she's currently working on. She's also currently at work on several projects that examine borders and migration from the standpoint of water as an epistemological site. Her book in progress, The Residual Migrant, draws on biotheory, border studies, and eco-criticism to theorize the ontologies specific to drowned migrants whose bodies are dissolved into ecologically ravaged deep sea environments. Since 2015, she has served as the editor of Expressions, Maghrebians, and since 2016 as vice president of the Center for Francophone Studies at the University of Leipzig, Germany. She currently sits on the advisory committee for PMLA, which she might tell us what that is, the Journal of the US Modern Literature Association, MLL, and is a former chair of the Executive Committee of the CLCS Mediterranean Forum at that association. So the Mediterranean, right, is this vast landscape or seascape or waterscape that you've spent a considerable time thinking through and with, and thinking of the bodies of migrants and what they mean for the ocean and what they mean for border crossings and what they mean for politics and aesthetics. We look forward to hearing from you, and over to you, Dr. Talbayev.
Thank you so much, Hugo, for this wonderful invitation to speak with you today. This is obviously a very commendable and a very powerful series, lecture series that honors the memories of those two exceptional advocates for peace and human rights and security. And it is truly my pleasure and my honor to be speaking at this event. So before starting, I would like to say just a few words of gratitude to our organizers. First and foremost, Professor Hugo Canham, who has kindly extended this invitation to me and whose excellent work resonates with many of my own preoccupations in very interesting ways. So I'm grateful for the conversation that we follow, as well as Professor Shana Sofla and Noxolo Dumani, who have smoothly and expertly managed every aspect of my participation today, as well as the two institutional partners, the Institute of Social and Health Science at the University of South Africa, as well as the Psychological Society of South Africa. I am sorry not to be with you in person tonight in South Africa, but I'm definitely appreciative of the opportunity to engage with you further during the Q&A, and I look very much forward to it. So as Professor Canham said, I've spent a significant amount of time, probably close to 15 years at this point, thinking about the Mediterranean in various contexts, through various connections, and most recently in relation to two fields of study, and this is what I will be discussing today. And there is little time for this intervention, so I will try not to give a sense of the whole project, which would be impossible. And I'm talking here about the second book that I'm working on called The Residual Migrant, but rather to focus a little bit on two main concepts that I tend to return to in my work, which are water borders and the residual migrant. And I'll talk about this in a second. But for now, just to give you a sense, since I know that most of you are not really familiar with the kind of discipline or work that I come from and that I do, I would like just to talk a little bit then about how I think about migration and the connection that I try to draw between migration on the one hand and the environment on the other. And so my focus in this project is the group, the population really of migrants, usually racialized migrants coming from West, North Africa, but also Central Asia and the Middle East through the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, in terms of illegal migration. So something that defies the political and legal regimes of citizenship and welcome of the European Union on the one hand. And then I try to link this to concerns with the environment in a materialist perspective. So a field that has emerged for the last 10, 15 years, which is called material eco-criticism, and by which I mean in this particular context, water as an element. So I don't just look at water as a trope, as is usually done in my field, or as a metaphor for something else, but at water as geopower, as an element that affects material change in the world, a force in a planetary perspective that decenters human agency. And this is a very big question that I will return to today in this intervention and beyond. This idea of thinking the human and what I call the more than human together, and trying to see where that leaves us in terms of thinking our own humanity, but also our engagement with politics, with society, and with the environment more generally. So I will now start sharing my screen. Please let me know if it works. I'll start here from the beginning. All right. Is this working?
Yes, it is.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I've given my talk today a tentative title because I just need concepts to think through when I put something like this together. So you can see it here on the slide: death by water, dissolution and forms of envying, just to set limits to my reflection today. So I am really inspired here by some of the very bracing questions that were posed in the rationale for this event that was shared online in the brochure, and I will summarize them here, or rather read them here. Who owns the water? Who can live off it? And who might die in the necropolitics of water? And I would like to add a fourth question to these questions here in relation to my own preoccupations in this talk, and that is, whose agency and power does water enact? Oops, the typo. So I like to begin with a definition of necropolitics, first of all, since this is the main conceptual thread that I'll be following through the presentation. And I will start with the definition that Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonian philosopher, has given in this book. This is a translation. It was written in French originally, but the translation came out in 2019. And this is what Mbembe has to say about necropower. The ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. To kill or to let live thus constitutes sovereignty's limits, its principal attributes. To be sovereign is to exert one's control over mortality and to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power, or here in this context, necropower. So necropower really is this power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. And this is what will color our reflection today in relation to the migration crisis in the Mediterranean. So in the context of my talk, necropower in the Mediterranean is exerted by the European Union, stalling migratory flows into Europe via natural spaces and elements that encircle its territory. So the Mediterranean is the context of which I will speak, and I will show maps of the Mediterranean in a minute, but I'm showing here a map of the Mozambique Channel between the Comoros Islands and Mayotte, the French territory right here on the screen, because this is not something happening only in the Mediterranean. And so I felt that it would be interesting to give maybe a more global perspective to the phenomenon. This involves multiple ocean and sea bodies, but also rivers. And I'm thinking of the Evros River, for instance, between Greece and Turkey on the east of the European Union, or the Rio Grande River here in the United States between Mexico and in the southern US. But also, and this is very interesting, desert spaces. The Sonora Desert in Mexico and Arizona in the United States, or the Sahara Desert in North Africa, which today could even be considered to be the southernmost border of the European Union. So a perspective focusing on geophysical agencies, like the one that I'm presenting today, reveals the power of natural forces to support life and, more important in this context, to enact death. It puts the spotlight on the biopolitical uses to which natural spaces are being put, as their own geological agency and processes are co-opted by punitive immigration policies to further their goals. The Mediterranean, for instance, drowns migrants, while the Sahara Desert dehydrates and eventually buries them. So what does it mean to think about the necropolitics of water? What is specific about the kind of death that it dispenses? What does this death reveal about the human, about the various models, various forms of being human, and their relation to the more than human world? So I would like first to talk about water borders, about the weaponization of water in the context of borderization, a process which turns the space of the Mediterranean into an impassable place for certain classes of populations. This is what I call here a water border. A specificity of the contemporary border regime is that borders may now be found absolutely anywhere. In the trenchant words of Etienne Balibar, borders are no longer at the border, which doesn't mean that borders have disappeared altogether, but rather that they are broadly disseminated. They have undergone a sort of disaggregation brought about by globalization, which makes them ubiquitous, inescapable, but also fractured and unstable. The regulatory forces of European sovereignty, for instance, the rescue operations, the militarized boats intercepting migrants, all of these encounters at sea map out additional border interfaces and other negotiations of territoriality and agency. Thinking water as border spotlights the power of water as interface, that is, as a fault line between two contradictory logics, the logic of the land and the logic of the sea. And very often, as we can see here in those visuals, in an entangled form, where does the land end, where does the water begin? It is from the tug of war between the two that surges the contested space of the water border, the permeable border space lying between the two logics of land and sea. And I mean here water borders taken in their polysemy as elemental, geophysical, geopolitical, and even necropolitical borders. So what are the two logics that come to abut on the water borders? First of all, land, the logic of land. Land has been associated in political philosophy, for instance, with concepts of stability, of certainty, clear definition. Land is the territory of secure identities, of imperial centers, of hegemonic structures that endure the test of time and disseminate far from the centers of power. It anchors what Edouard Glissant, the Martiniquais poet, has called arrow-like trajectories of colonialism, of genocide, dynamics of conflict and extraction, of forced mobility, oftentimes across the watery expanses of the globe. Land is human agency, power over aquatic spaces. It lends form to water's matter. It lends shape to its plasticity. In the other column, we have water, which in contrast bespeaks ungroundedness, relationality, and mobility, in Maïve McCuskers' words. It is the domain of fluidity, interconnections, and crossings. The ocean, through its mass and volume, embodies the sheer magnitude of water's geopower, that is, its natural power to inflect and reshuffle other orders of magnitude, either human or more than human, that is, geophysical, terrestrial, or planetary levels of life, that is to say, whatever lies beyond the dictum of human desire and willpower. Yet water is also depth, abyss, unfathomable volume. It is pure might beyond human attempts at mastery. Water, in fact, obeys its own logic. So to think about water border is to explore the enmeshed order of landed logics and their waterborne execution, to think the entanglement of the human and more than human. Let us then consider these dynamics specifically in the context of the Mediterranean Sea. And I have here a map of main migration roads from North Africa and the Middle East into Europe across the Mediterranean. Since the late 80s, the unequal mobility regime between global North and global South has increasingly strengthened. It has marked out the Mediterranean Sea as a space of disparity and violence between distinct categories of the humans, of humanity. So European citizens on the one hand, here in the northern part of the map, endowed with the privileges of citizenship, including the ability to cross the sea at will for no other purposes than hedonistic pursuits. And on the other hand, disenfranchised migrants from the rest of the Mediterranean space, deemed unwelcome, undesirable, in other words, an excess population to be managed, as what Zygmunt Bauman has called the waste of a neoliberal world system, unwilling to recognize their inherent humanity. This differential regime of mobility is a product, of course, of entrenched colonial hierarchies, stretching into the contemporary moment. And it harkens back to a long history of discrimination and racialization of otherness in Western Europe. It has transformed the sea into an impassable wall. Cross-border movement has grown increasingly limited under the combined effects of increased surveillance, the interception of rescue operations at sea, which oftentimes are now illegal, and the outsourcing of border enforcement to non-European states on the southern shore of the sea. And the case of Libya comes to mind. This discriminatory regime has brought further precarities to the flow of crossings, as a logic of security has turned the Mediterranean into a hostile environment where each year thousands of irregularized, undocumented men, women, and children come to meet a tragic death. And we have here a map with data about arrivals versus drownings at sea. As an example, the odds of perishing at sea have risen from 1 in 42 in 2017 to 1 in 18 in 2018. So a sharp rise there as well, which goes along with this increasingly hostile policy enacted through the space of the sea. The Mediterranean has morphed into a space of surveillance, disappearance, and decimation. In its perimeter, water has come to enforce the European Union's punitive, security-based approach to migration. It is now an aqueous border, a fluid borderscape, mediating a form of liquid violence, in the words of Charles Heller and Lorenzo Pezzani. And water borders are mediating an order of violence, born of capitalism writ large. So in this logic, lives considered to lie in excess or to be superfluous are designated to be eliminated. It is water that enacts this death sentence, hence the title of the talk, Death by Water, sorry. At sea, and we have a number of media sources here testifying to that and bearing witness to that. At sea, the capsized migrants are left without protection to brave the elements, often at the price of their lives. As rescue operations get increasingly unreliable, when not done right and lawful, sea crossers are left marooned in the physical realm of water, in its volume, its untamable geopower. They are reduced to their absolute physical materiality, facing up to another irreducible materiality, that of water, which is far more powerful. They turn into objects, into targets of the universal right of predation exerted by Europe. They become bare bodies in the designation of Giorgio Agamben, mere matter, in fact, left behind after the drowning to sustain the attacks of the watery element and its corrosion. They morph crucially into what I call the residual migrant. So I'll talk a little bit about this, and then I'll present a few ideas and takeaways that might help us orient our Q&A later on. But first, a few words in the few minutes I have left about what I mean by the residual migrant. So in my reading, water has become more than just a border space. It has become, in fact, the very substance through which the deadly logic of borderization is enacted. Through seawater, eruptive migrant bodies are dissolved, physically disintegrated. Under the relentless assault of corrosive water, as well as marine life, over time, bodies turn into chemical molecules. They are gradually released as molecules into the primordial ooze of oceanic waters, awaiting reformation into other organic or inorganic structures. In water, subjectivity is disintegrated. Subjects are dissolved into elemental particles, dispersed into the hydrocarbons before being reincorporated. The degradation process perpetrated on those courses calls into question the ideals of subjective individualism, autonomy, and sovereignty underpinning the regime of rights and privileges derived from the Enlightenment. These bodies are reduced to their most immediate molecular materiality. They only take on meaning within the endless cycle of decomposition and reformation. Displaced around the hydrosphere in an endless migration, these molecules that compose them enter the food chain. They become absorbed and re-embodied in different biological structures. They disperse and settle on the seabed, sometimes stratifying into lithic time. In the wake of this longue durée watery dissolution, one body surges from another body. One body feeds another body through transmutation and reformation in a morphology of perpetual becoming. The moving divide between water and body, between geology and living being, is corroded through water's decomposition and recomposition of bodies. Astrid Neymanis, whom I've brought up here, has argued that all bodies are necessarily brought into being by another body of water that dissolves partially or completely to water the bodies that will follow. From one body surges another body then, through dissolution, transmutation, and reformation. An important reminder that being in water requires a morphology of becoming. This model of being in the world in constant fluctuation is what I refer to when I speak of a residual migrant, and I've jotted down a few words here to try and pin down the concept a little better. And it's really knotted around this issue of residuality, which I understand to be an ontology marked by the intimate embodied vulnerability of submerged bodies at the mercy of elemental violence. So what does this mean as far as thinking through water is concerned? These macabre ontologies that I have described pave the way for the construction of forms of life that engage the geological and that cross the human, more than human divide. They mark out bodies and the earth as co-inscribed across time. Residuality reveals the porousness of the two and their reciprocity, with bodies converting into geological dust, which itself becomes actualized through its re-embodiment in new forms of life, calcium going into bones, etc. Rethinking the human through the aqueous opens up new perspectives across this logic of bordering, both in spatial but also in ontological terms. In the intimacy of submerged bodies, water reveals the intrinsic porousness of humans, their vulnerability to their environments, elemental environments. After all, human bodies are 60% water. We're born of water in the evolutionary sense, the primordial ocean in which life appeared, but also on a human scale through the amniotic liquid sustaining us, or the fluid exchanges embedded us with body of water through tears, perspiration, breath, etc. So these forms of existence through residuality stretch the line between human and non-human, and they blur the boundary between the biological and the geophysical. Thinking about the human through dissolution is therefore to highlight its materiality, its co-constitution with the non-human world that includes it. These movements emphasize the ontological thickness of water, its dense memorial weft. In water, the lingering traces of those bodies that are dissolved remain, living on in their materiality against any necropolitical efforts to do away with them completely. They endure, in other words, in other material form. In a sense, we could even argue that residuality functions as a way to undermine the eradication of life perpetrated by biopolitical powers. But this is a slightly different argument, and though I'm happy to discuss it further in the Q&A for now, I like to simply emphasize what residuality tells us about connections between the human and the more than human, and more specifically here, the kinship between the human and the world beyond the human. So let me then move on to a few takeaways by way of conclusion that that summarize in a way the ways in which residuality relates to the order of biopolitical violence, or how water necroviolence relates to the stratified deep time of geophysical temporalities. And here are a few of the multiple forms of tension and struggle between the human geopolitical aspect of things and elemental agencies. In other words, some of the tensions and back and forth between landed or human logics and aquatic or elemental logics that I have tried to bring up. So first of all, our examination reveals water's complicity with a biopolitical order marked by the domination and obliteration of an infrahumanity caught up in the planetary currents of neoliberalism. It puts a magnifying glass over the refusal to see migrants in their distinct humanity as individual subjects, humans deserving of life rather than mere survival. It divulges the instrumentalization of water's elemental force to serve purposes of human biopolitics against other orders of the human. Second, through a focus on seawater as volume and corruptive substance, I've tried to restore the underwater dimension of waters, their verticality, and the biopolitical devastation that they enact in the contested terrain of the sea. In this sense, focusing on residuality belies surface level dynamics of felicitous, progress-inducing sea crossings, like trade, diasporas, globalizations, and really reveals that under the surface exist invisible and very powerful forms of intimate violence. So it complicates borders, in other words. Third, this theoretical adjustment undoes dominant paradigms of human exceptionalism through this anthropological category of the anthropos, right? The human subject exerting mastery over nature. In this position, all humans are not seen to be united in a position of superiority to nature. Here, certain categories of humans are considered to be subaltern, and in fact, they collide with the natural environment in a position of objection. In the maritime abyss, human vulnerability to the violence of empire is evident. The human is only granted its anthropological advantage under specific circumstances. Bearing migrants' bodies means to profoundly dehumanize them, to demote them from subjecthood to objecthood. It is to mark their humanity with a seal of conditionality. It means, in other words, fracturing the category of the human along hierarchical lines. This, and this is my fourth point, this delineates new conceptions of solidarity and commonality between the human and the more than human. Human and natural histories are both dependent on the same transnational dynamic of extraction and destruction. Those dynamics transform the planet into zones to be plundered, what Naomi Klein has called sacrifice zones, for instance, but also its most vulnerable inhabitants into obstacles to be eliminated. The water-focused reading of illegal migration reveals the common condition of subalternity across human, more than human categories in this moment of global neoliberalism. In this sense, and this is the final conclusion, it proposes a new sense of responsibility and encourages recognition of other models of coexistence with the non-human world that would not just be extractive and destructive. Here, our very survival as humans is at stake in the need to recognize marginalized populations, as well as our environmental commons as being worthy of protection. For all the water is here subjected to human necropolitical purposes, its own uncontainable agency is a force to be reckoned with, a raw power that time and time again has made itself evident in the cataclysmic weather events that are increasingly affecting multiple parts of the world. For instance, increasingly more powerful hurricanes in the part of the world that I live in, or floods. Water ultimately escapes dominion and control. Its agency far surpasses that of humans purporting to have tamed it. And I will stop here, but I would like to end with some inspiring words from Donna Haraway, staying with the trouble, which I have brought up here. We require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations. We become with each other or not at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've always known that literary scholars have all the fun. and your scholarship and conceptual lens, that those capacious nature kind of confirms that. I mean, you take us to many places, and I think of Sylvia Winter's chain of being in trying to decenter the human because of what the ranking system of man bequeaths us, right? This competition with the natural world, or humans that are disposable, that you think with in the ocean, those who can die or dieable. And the residence time concept too, right? Well, you don't call it that, but Christina Sharp calls it residence time, the time that enslaved bodies who were drowned in the ocean centuries ago do time in the ocean, and these resonances with your work in what those bodies actually do down there and how long they stay, and the kind of work that they're doing, in kind of wake work in her terms. And I will save this for questions around this water as spiritual, right? For you to possibly, because on the African continent, and I know that elsewhere, water bodies are also kind of sentient spaces where people are renewed in various ways. So thank you very much for that. And now I'm going to introduce our respondent, Professor Brendon Barnes, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Johannesburg. He writes in psychology, environmental health, and justice, and has worked on studies of air pollution, housing, lead poisoning, mercury, water and sanitation, and climate change more broadly. He also serves as the chairperson of the steering committee of the Department of Science, I should have just read the acronym, DSI, NRF, Center of Excellence in Human Development. He has published studies in various high-impact journals and chapters in sought-after edited collections. He's won teaching and academic citizenship awards, as well as research awards. Professor Barnes is known to champion the integration of justice into environmental and climate psychology, and was recently invited to address the 15th United Nations Annual Psychology Day on Climate Action. So in our midst, we have a scholar who's thought deeply on these matters and advocates for climate justice. Thank you for joining us, Professor Barnes, and over to you for your thoughts and provocations before we move to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Thank you so much, everyone, and good afternoon. Good afternoon to members of the Omar and Mohabi family, and to the reps from SAISA and PAPO. A huge thank you to the speakers today. I would just like to start my response by commending the organizers for this forward-thinking memorial lecture, and really, to use your words, for pushing the frontiers in our thinking about peace, safety, and human rights. So I'm really pleased to be here to respond to these two wonderful presentations. Professor Sufla, it is indeed an opportune moment, as you mentioned, both in terms of the environment and climate crisis currently unfolding, but also the wars that pervade our time. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the two presentations. Water, life and death seems to be such an obvious aspect for peace, safety and human rights. So it's remarkable to me that we do not talk more about this, and of course in greater detail. There's so much to talk about, and from so many different angles and viewpoints. There are so many ways to frame the issues that we're thinking about today. But I think the organizers were really clever in compelling us to think about life and death and treading the shoreline in the context of the politics of water. So I'm really grateful, and this was a really useful way to think about the issues. My only complaint to the organizers is that perhaps we needed more time. 2 hours is really short, so I'm hoping that after this memorial lecture, we'll continue these conversations in different forums. Thank you to both presenters, Dr. Talbayev and Dr. Mahlakeng, for such interesting presentations. I'm sure we can agree that they both successfully rose to the challenge presented to us by the organizers to think through the topic, albeit in different ways. For Dr. Mahlakeng's presentation, I think it was really useful to provide an upstream, technical, policy-driven case study of the Nile Basin politics, and also just to remind us of the deep historical, social, and political embeddedness of this particular issue. Importantly, he pointed out the potential for conflict and how upstream macro politics and the structural factors influence water access and availability in context of water scarcity. For Dr. Talbayev's presentation, I think you showed very useful insights into this concept of water borders and how water is used and abused as symbolic and physical elements in exclusions of migrants. But water is also a site of weaponization, and we see this as a constant throughout the water politics arena, and importantly, a site of militarization to protect spaces, ironically, even spaces that are protected for their biodiversity and naturalness, such as national parks. But very importantly for me, you raised a very important question, and that is, whose agency and power does water execute? So in this response, I think I'll attempt to do two things. The one is I will try to identify and perhaps synthesize two themes from both speakers. The first is about control and power over water, and the other one speaks to water as being agentic in and of itself. Both of these themes have implications for peace, security, and human rights. The second thing I'm going to do is to bring some ideas that I think are important in terms of work, future work, and work worthy of exploring. But before I proceed, I think the name of the memorial lecture was very intriguing to me, Treading the Shorelines. And it really got me thinking, and knowing the organizers, who are very clever people, I think this was also an invitation to us to think about some of the themes that might be evoked in terms of treading the shorelines and themes of life and death. For me, it was about in-betweenness of life and death, the land and the sea, the human and non-human, movement and stagnation, but importantly, an invitation for us to tread carefully and to tread respectfully and sensitively, and with psychological, social, and ecological balance in mind. So with these few words, I would like to just draw out the first theme that I think the two speakers touched on. And that is that water is fundamentally about power and control. In brackets in my notes, I have wielding power and control. And this power and control is typically by the rich over the poor. And both presenters did a remarkable job of this. They spoke about power, about the ownership of water, about its distribution, about its use and abuse in hydro and maritime diplomacy at the global level, its power to govern and subjugate at the local level, its power to give life and take life, its power to destroy, cleanse, and rejuvenate. Water, of course, permeates our very being. Perhaps so much so that its taken for grantedness means that we often relegate it to the background, to the backdrop of many of these issues. And thanks to this memorial lecture, I think the two presentations really did a good job of foregrounding it. Unless, of course, something drastic happens, then we start talking about water. For Dr. Talbayev, I think you turning this on its head, and looking at life and death through the politics and the necropolitics of water, really allowed us to see things differently. It allowed us to view the precarity of life and death and how politics is infused in terms of how we think about life and death through the lens of water. For Dr. Mahlakeng, I think you really did bring home the unfairness of global, regional, and local policies, especially in the context of how water is used and deployed therein. Of course, both of you got us to think about the various social inequalities that are reflected in water and reflected in society and impacts at large. So here I'm thinking about the disproportionate impacts on availability of water. Here I'm thinking about the politics of water and migration, as was so eloquently put across. I'm thinking about diplomacy, research and resource protection, public health, dignity, peace and conflict. It also revealed for me the different kinds of social asymmetries, the different isms that are embedded in the politics of water. Racism, classism, sexism, ableism, we see it all if we look at the issues from the politics of water. Importantly, we see how migration is an important theme in the politics of water that really reflects a lot of the old hierarchies that Dr. Mahlakeng points out. Often when I speak to young people, which I do quite often about climate change issues and education, they ask me, what is this thing called environmental racism? How can water be racist? And of course, my immediate response is that people are racist. And often these issues, such as water access and quality, intersects with the biases we have inherent in society. And nowhere are these biases more evident to me than in one, the control, management, hegemony, and oppressive practices of bulk water supply that Dr. Mahlakeng so beautifully captured in his presentation. I think another issue that perhaps wasn't touched on in that much detail is this idea of the privatization of water and the technopolitics, to quote von Schnitzler, of water management. Around the world, water is being privatized at a rapid rate, often in the name of development and access to better quality water. Prepaid water meters are a prime example of this, where these water meters are implemented often with very little or to no consultation with local populations. In terms of regulating water, and often with unfair practices in mind, for example, to save water because poor people, quote unquote, are prone to wasting water. Of course, the water privatization issue comes with much higher costs, lots of disproportionate impacts on the poor, very weak labor regulations, lots of labor abuses, lots of cost-cutting and public health threats, and of course, failure to implement any necessary developmental upgrades. And often this serves to pass the onus of water access onto the poor. In many instances, water privatization is also associated with attempts to silence critics. Environmental, water, and climate defenders are often subjected to overt violence, but also legal attempts to shut them up in the form of SLAP suits, strategic litigation against public participation suits, lots of threats to keep people quiet. And of course, violence against environmental defenders is quite common across the world. There are watchdogs around the world looking at this issue, and a lot of this violence is or revolves around access to water and the protection of natural water resources. And don't get me wrong, this is not just in the global south. This is happening all over the world. The example of the Flint, Michigan issue of lead poisoning comes to mind, that what happened under the guise of water privatization in that part of the world. So the second theme for me is that, because we start to think about these ideas and about power, about control over water, but the second theme for me that I drew out from the two talks is that water is in itself agentic. Water has agency. Dr. Talbayev wonderfully drew our attention to the artificial distinction between the human and non-human world. This idea that there are hierarchies, that humans can control nature, and that nature is there at our service. Nature is also there to be exploited. And she points out this idea of residuality that really dissolves these distinctions between the human and more than human world. And if we think we can control water, If water is only there to be exploited or to be managed, we are sadly mistaken. The climate crisis that's unfolding at a rapid rate is really bringing home the necessity for us to think through different ways of engaging with ideas of water and water access. And this false dichotomy between human and non-human, or more than human, it really is holding us back. We have to rethink our relationship with the flora, fauna, the supernatural, the spiritual, and the ancestral that Professor Canham spoke about. And water is fundamental to this in many parts of the world. Our current approaches are not working on so many levels, and both speakers so powerfully drew our attention to points of solidarity that we could engage with, not just between people, not just between different parts of the world, not in terms of diplomatic sense, but also in terms of the human and more than human dismantling of some of the hierarchies that keep us where we are today. So in conclusion, what do we need to do? I think there's a lot more work across disciplines and across sectors to be done to really promote fresh thinking about our relationship with water. Now, here, I don't want to be too descriptive, but certainly in my own work and in reading about what's happening around the world, there's a lot of interesting ideas around, theorizing, around practice, around methodologies and scholarly activities in relation to water. And these may include public ideas around water as a public good, the commons, interesting ideas coming from materialism and new materialism, ideas around One Health, some psychological theories that are being developed also to bring in upstream as well as micro level ideas in relation to resource access, ecofeminism, and the arts. I was really pleased by some of the discussion earlier around the arts. And here, I'm always excited to look at what's happening in the visual arts, the literary arts, climate science fiction, speculative fiction. I must just mention Dr. Nick Wood, who was part of the CISA Climate and Environmental Psychology group, who passed away recently. He really did amazing work in terms of climate science fiction, and his latest book that was published quite recently, I think it was in 2022, Water Must Fall, is a must-read for anyone interested in the psychopolitics of water access and injustices. The second thing that I wish to foreground is that often the poor are blamed for their circumstances, their lack of access to water. And importantly, are asked to rectify some of these issues around the politics of water. If one looks at the the education campaigns that happen around adaptation to water scarcity, it really frightens me to think of how this could come about. It's absurd to me to think about how very expensive behavior change campaigns accompany some of these oppressive practices to change people's minds, to change people's attitudes and behaviors. One example that's been widely written about was Operation Green Amanzi here in Johannesburg, where there was an infrastructural component to the campaign to fix up water pipes and leakages and so forth. But importantly, there was a psychoeducation campaign that asked and in some ways prescribed how poor people should use water, to the point of how many times they should flush the toilet a day. And to me, that's just absurd that this continues to happen and that the poor continue to be blamed for larger issues around water access. Finally, I think there's a lot more work to document and support and get behind and provide solidarity with communities who are reclaiming power in relation to hydropolitics. There are wonderful initiatives out there, reclaiming the history of indigenous peoples, relationships with water and nature, taking back stories of water and the African experiences, for example, and relationships to water, thinking about water and migration from a historical perspective, the important role of sailors during enslavement and liberation, and the role of water therein, There's also huge opportunity, I think, to get behind some of the anti-privatization networks and protests are currently underway. And I think huge opportunity in terms of youth activism, and lots of youth activism happening at the moment, particularly activism trying to facilitate solidarity between different youth groups. And very importantly, and perhaps bringing it back to Minister Dalla Omar, is a huge need for us as scholar activists to get behind the many legal challenges broadly in the field of hydropolitics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Barnes. That was really deftly done in thinking about both presentations on from rivers to oceans, with an insider knowledge that you have from the activism work that sees the structural in the mundane and the daily operations of state and capital. We appreciate that, and in the responses, we're going to tag questions onto your input so that the panelists can respond all at once. I'm going to read out a few questions and invite people to add these to the chat, I think, or to lift their hands. I've got 3 questions up front that have already been communicated. And then if we can take 2 more on top of those, and then allow our panelists to engage with those. And if we have time, we'll have a second round of questions before we head towards closure. So I'm not sure if the fellow panelists and yourself, Brendon, can see the question which I will read out. How much water is consumable and how much is saline water? If then water is the next oil that probably will bring civil war to countries, what is to be done by governments to safeguard our consumable water? And this is by Tsitsita. I note that Dr. Mahlakeng engaged the question about water as being the next oil, so he might have the first stab at that. And then another question from, I'll tell you now, yeah, from Fatima Peters, is reflecting on the politics of water, for example, deep sea mining. How much do we protect marginalized communities? Or how do we protect marginalized communities' rights across the world against this capitalist license to extract from the natural world, right? And I'm going to obviously sneak in something from me, but which is not really a question to Edwige, which is about, water borders constantly reminded me as you were speaking of waterboarding, right? The practice that governments, state operatives use to extract information from people who are potentially terrorists. Can we have another question, if there is, before we hand over to yourselves? And if there are none for now, that I don't see them, I'm going to hand over to yourselves then. Do you want to start, Dr. Mahlakeng, on this question of war, right? The potential for conflict around water and what is to be done?
Thank you very much. Yes, to Tsitsita, yes, it is true that water, it is the next oil. Here we talk of a militaristic defense, how water is being treated in the same light as oil has been treated. In the context of the Nile River Basin, in 1978, Anwar Sadat made a statement that said the only matter that could take Egypt to war again, now it's in the 70s, just during the period when Egypt was going to war with Israel, that could take Egypt to war again is water. In addition to that, he said, we shall never hesitate to go to war because water is a matter of life or death, despite the fact that they've denied other African parent countries access to water for the sake of life. And on top of that, when we talk about water being the next one and it being defended or ensured through militaristic defense, I don't know, probably coming in the context of South Africa and Lesotho, me coming from Lesotho, we would remember the 1998 SADC or South African-led SADC intervention in Lesotho, when there was a protest in Lesotho over election results. Now, what the Prime Minister at that time, what he wrote to President Nelson Mandela, who eventually sent the late Mangosuthu Buthelezi to South Africa to lead that mission, but he said so that South Africa could intervene in that war. He didn't say it's an election, it's a war or dispute over election results. What he said was, these people are placing a threat over the Lesotho Islands water project. Then the first thing, because the protests were taking place here in Maseru, the first thing that the South African army did was to fly over Maseru into the highlands, and that's where they fought and killed Lesotho military personnel that were guarding the dams, in the misconception that those military personnel were there to threaten the dam and supply of water to South Africa. So this shows us how water is being protected and ensured through a militaristic defense, and a threat of it resulting into life and death. And what I would say to Dao is that water is a resource that must be shared for the sake of ensuring life at the face of death. It shouldn't just pass by your doorstep, but it should be shared in literal sense. In literal sense, meaning its utilization and its management to ensure sustainability. Here we are in the Nile dealing and arguing, and the Nile is arguing and fighting at the precipice of a war over colonial and outdated agreement. So yes, in the terms of interstate conflict, I would answer that. But as far as I see in his question, there's a term, a word he used, that he or she used, that said civil war. I normally avoid the word war. I use the word conflict to symbolize either verbal, political, or a violent nature of things. A civil conflict already ensues when you look at what is happening in Sudan, what is happening in Ethiopia, what is happening in these 11 recurring countries. The civil war you are seeing there, a large part of it is a result of the famine that is occurring at the background of the inability to access water and to develop industries and agriculture that would depend or require the usage of water. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahlakeng. As Edwige gets ready to respond, might I remind attendees that want to complete CPD points, the ethics form is attached in the chat. Over to you, and what we're going to do, because I'm looking at the clock, is that we're going to take this as the last response and then hand over to Professor Sachs. Thank you. Over to you.
All right, thank you. With regard to water as resource, I don't have much to say, but I will just say this, that in the Middle East, if you look at the line, there were maps that were drawn of, flashpoint conflicts in the last 20, 30 years, and then the aridity line, and its evolution, because obviously it has been encroaching upon formerly arable territory. You actually see the two lines almost completely laid over each other. And that's very interesting, because you realize that in terms of geopolitics and conflict, a lot is coming from the environmental resource crisis that this period of the Anthropocene is creating. So that was just a small remark in addition to Professor Mahlakeng's response. As for the protection of marginalized groups, this is something that is absolutely crucial, and that to me brings into play another position that I haven't really talked about, but which is indigenous rights in relation to water, obviously, but also in relation to this kind of extractive logic that we are inhabiting right now. It's the work of activism. It's the work of coalition, in my perspective, the work of trying to propose an alternative model to what is currently enacted. But when it comes to rivers and water on land, so to speak, it's a different model than the oceans. The oceans obviously are a hydrocarbon, but not quite, because if you look at the UN clause, the UN law of the Sea Convention, for instance, you have up to 200 kilometers offshore that is exclusive economic opportunity for each sea adjacent country. So it is not really a hydrocarbons. You already have this kind of economic logic taking over any thinking about the ocean as a common resource. So these are big structures, big economic and political structures that you have to stand up to. And so the work of activism and coalition, I think, is the path forward of how to do that exactly. It's obviously a very difficult question, but it is something that needs to be anchored locally as well, precisely because those neoliberal dynamics are just globally diffused and enacted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I mean, you're talking about local activism. What we see along the South African coast, for example, communities like that in Olobeni against mining, which is on land, but really close to the water, to the ocean. And they are simultaneously protesting against oceanic exploitation, because mining close to the ocean would, of course, impact the ecological system and livelihoods around fishing. And we see how fishing along the ocean, fishing communities, old fishing communities, right, have been pushed off the ocean by legislation in the current dispensation in South Africa, and the effects that has when the reason for the legislation is supposedly environmental, while big fishing companies are given access to the ocean, right? And what that means. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Sachs-Cooper to give us the closing comments. We will all know, if you are from South Africa, who Professor Sachs-Cooper is. And he's worn many hats before. He is on the board of the Institute for Social and Health Sciences, but he's also the president of the Pan-African Psychology Union. Thank you, and over to you, Professor Cooper.
Thank you so much. I want to commend the Institute for choosing these two speakers who have given us a powerful biopolitical connection between one of the few basic requirements for all forms of life, water, besides air and sunshine, and ourselves. As we know, deuterium, an isotope of hydrogen, is the second most abundant element in the human body after sodium. I want to commend Dr. Khosi Mahlakeng for talking about the Nile, and in his Q&A referred to the Lesotho Water Highlands project, which is in phase 2 now, and which in 1998, Gacha Buthelezi was acting president, and Musiwa Lekota was our Minister of Defense. Musiwa Lekota is a Sesotho-speaking person, actually believing that Lesotho should not exist. And sure enough, he coerced or convinced Gacha Buthelezi that they should fly over, and actually ended up killing a few of the Lesotho soldiers. I actually, yesterday, I was in a city of Johannesburg event, sitting with Musiwa Lekota, who was one of my co-accused in the SASO BPC trial. Dr. Mahlakeng actually did deal with this elephant in the room, because South Africa is wasting well over 40% of the water of this second phase from Lesotho because of sheer lack of maintenance and extracting at a huge cost to Lesotho that water. So he's dealt with it in a very sensitive manner. But it's interesting also that Egypt, which is part of the largest non-polar desert in the world, the Sahara, is actually one of the two most water secure countries on the continent. I think Tunisia is another. So Dr. Edwige Talbayev, thanks for raising the residual migrant and the liquid violence, and lest we forget the hundreds of thousands of persons who leave the Middle East and Africa and who are captured in different ways, not only by the waters of the Mediterranean, but those countries that are part of the Mediterranean, and about control of our bodies. Water, the very old yet new source of life, death, and war. And I think that all of you have done us proud, bringing this together in a very erudite, very singular manner. And on behalf of the Institute, on behalf of SAISA and PAPU, thank you all for your massive contribution and eye-opener on this next weaponization that is already underway in our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cooper. We appreciate those words and your inflections of the points that have been made. Nokolo, could I ask you, Nokolo Dumane has been helping us behind the scenes to give us your word.
Yes, Prof. Thank you. So on page 11 of his book, titled Prioritized Death Estate, Prof. Hugo Gakenem writes, because the land and the water are central to how people die, live, and order their lives, my theorizing is grounded in the sociality enabled by the environment, the spirits or supernatural, and the embodiment. So today's lectures and offerings are a testament to this kind of theorizing that Prof. Hugo talks about in his book. Colleagues, my name is Nokolo Dumane, and I'm a researcher based at Unisa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. And it is my honor and privilege to give a vote of thanks on behalf of Unisa, SAISA, and PAPU today. So first and foremost, I would like to take a moment to appreciate and honor the late Mr. Johannes Moabi, Brajo, as he was fondly known to colleagues at the Institute, and Minister Dula Omar, whose legacies have brought us here and whose legacies we continue to celebrate. And to their families, thank you for continuing to honor and speak on the legacies of Minister Omar and Mr. Moabi. May you continue finding the strength to keep their work going. Secondly, to the panelists, Dr. Talbayev and Dr. Mahlakeng, thank you for honoring our invitation to speak and share your thoughts on water as an element of life and death. Your contributions today flag the importance of water in both social and political context. So Prof. Vance, thank you for carefully and creatively engaging the panelists' thoughts and provocations. And then to Dr. Dijani, who couldn't be here with us today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Our heartfelt thoughts and prayers are with you and the Palestinian people. To Prof. Cooper, thank you for a moving closing message that served as a reminder to us as academics that the work is never done. And then thirdly, to our collaborating organizations, the Unisa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences, the Psychological Society of South Africa, and the Pan-African Psychology Union. Thank you for bringing this event to life and for continuously providing space for such important moving conversations. And lastly, to you, the audience, thank you for enriching and keeping the discussion today engaging. As we leave here, may you carry forward the knowledge and insights gained today and let them serve as a beacon in academic and activist pursuits. Thank you, and go see and have a lovely weekend.
Thanks very much, Knox. We appreciate that. can I do something that was not on script since we passed time? If Professor Sidat is still on, won't you please put your camera on? Professor Sidat has led the Institute for more than 3 decades and retires at the end of this year. So while he'll attend future lectures, and we'll probably ask him to talk soon, this is his last lecture under which supervision we have worked and care and thought. And if Professor Sidat could just show his face so that we might honor him with these hearts and thumbs up that are appearing on the screen on the side. Professor Sidat, are you there?
Professor.
Self-effacing as usual, Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hugo pulled a move on me. Thanks.
And you were suitably dressed, actually. I was testing that actually to see if you're wearing a t-shirt. Professor Sidat, we are grateful for your leadership and thank you very much. Colleagues, presenters, we appreciate you honoring this lecture, and the family of those that are being honored here. Thank you for accompanying us. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.